The first light of winter broke like a fragile promise over the frontier. The sun, pale and reluctant, dragged its face across the jagged rim of the mountains, spilling light over the frozen woods. Each tree stood like a weary sentinel, its bark glazed with ice, its branches bowed under the burden of snow. From somewhere deep within those woods came the slow, rhythmic sound of an axe biting through timber, a heartbeat of survival echoing against the stillness. Elias Crow worked alone, as he always did. His breath rose in white clouds, dissolving into the cold. Each swing of his axe carried the weight of something unspoken. Remorse, perhaps, or exile. Men in town said he was cursed. Some said the trees whispered his name as he felled them, warning the others to fall easy for the man who carried guilt heavier than any log. He didn't argue with them. He hadn't spoken to another soul in months. It was near dusk when he heard the faint crunch of snow behind him. He turned, slow and wary, his gloved hand still gripping the axe. A woman was making her way through the drifts. A child clutched close to her chest. Her face was half hidden by a woolen scarf, but her steps carried the stubbornness of someone who had run out of choices. The boy's head rested on her shoulder, limp and pale. "Please," she said, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "He's burning up. I didn't know where else to go." Elias looked past her, as if expecting someone else to appear. A husband, perhaps. But there was only silence and the widening bruise of twilight. He hesitated, then nodded toward the cabin tucked behind the trees. "Inside," he said, the word rough with disuse. The fire in his hearth hadn't seen company in years. He laid the boy near it, the child's breath shallow, face flushed with fever. The woman knelt beside him, rubbing his hands as if trying to coax warmth back into them. The air smelled of pine resin and wet wool. Elias crouched beside the fire, adding more wood, the orange light painting the cabin walls with flickering ghosts. "I'm Maeve," she said after a moment, not meeting his eyes. "Maeve Callahan. My boy's name is Tommy. We came from town, but the snow—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as if finishing the sentence might break her. Elias nodded once, wordless. He poured water into a kettle and set it near the fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled off her gloves. He could see the rawness of her knuckles, the thinness of her coat. Widow, he thought, though she hadn't said it. Grief had a shape you learned to recognize, even from across a room. That night, after Tommy's fever began to break, Elias stepped outside to fetch more wood. The wind had picked up, curling snow through the branches like ghostly fingers. He paused, staring at the faint glow spilling from his cabin window. The first sign of life his home had shown in years. A strange ache rose in him, both painful and tender. He didn't know what to call it yet. In town the next day, gossip traveled faster than wildfire. Martha Odell, who ran the general store, caught him by the door. "Elias Crow, you've got the widow Callahan up there in your cabin?" Her tone carried that brittle curiosity that always followed sin. "People'll talk, you know." "Let them," he said simply, paying for the medicine and leaving before she could say more. But her words trailed him all the way home, weaving themselves into the cold air like smoke. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the cabin changed. Maeve moved with quiet precision. Boiling broth, mending torn sleeves, sweeping floors that had long been left to dust. Elias found himself pausing to listen to the small sounds she made. The soft scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the creak of her chair by the fire. It was as if life, hesitant and fragile, had crept back into the house on tiptoe. Tommy, once frightened by Elias's size and silence, began to follow him outside, fascinated by the way the axe split wood so cleanly. Elias showed him how to hold it, how to read the grain. The boy's laughter, when it came, startled him. It was a sound he hadn't heard in so long that it felt like a forgotten language. Still, Maeve kept her distance. At night, Elias would hear her murmuring softly to her son, the words too low to catch. Sometimes she would fall silent mid-sentence, and he knew she was crying, though she never let him see. He didn't ask why. Some griefs were sacred. A week passed before she spoke of leaving. "Once the snow softens," she said, folding a blanket, "we'll head back to town. I don't want to trouble you longer than we have." Elias only nodded, though something tightened in his chest at the thought. Trouble, he wanted to tell her, was silence. Trouble was having no one to share the firelight with. But words had never been his craft. That night, the storm returned, fierce and unrelenting. The cabin shuddered beneath its weight. Snow howled through the gaps in the shutters, and Elias rose to mend them. Maeve joined him without a word, holding the lantern steady while he nailed the boards. When their hands brushed, her fingers cold against his rough ones, the moment hung between them. Brief, but alive. By morning, the The world outside was buried. No one would be traveling anywhere. The snowdrifts had swallowed the path to town. Maeve stared out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "They'll talk," she murmured. "They always do." Elias set down his cup. "Let them," he said again, his voice low. But this time, it carried a softness it hadn't before. The days that followed moved in quiet repetition. Elias chopped wood, Maeve cooked, Tommy built small forts from kindling. The three of them shared meals, each one a little less guarded than the last. Occasionally, Elias caught Maeve watching him, her expression unreadable, part gratitude, part wonder, part something she tried to hide. When the thaw began, the peace shattered. Sheriff Amos Grady rode up to the cabin, his horse kicking up wet snow. Behind him, the preacher from town sat stiffly in his saddle. Elias stepped outside to meet them, wiping his hands on his coat. "Afternoon, Crow," the sheriff said, his breath misting in the cold. "Word is, you've got company that don't belong here." Maeve appeared at the doorway, the boy clinging to her skirt. The preacher's face tightened with disapproval. "It isn't fitting," he said, "a widow sharing quarters with a man, alone in the woods. The town won't have it." Elias felt something dark coil inside him. But before he could speak, Maeve's voice cut through the cold air. "We're not doing wrong," she said, though her voice shook. "We're just trying to survive." "Survival's one thing," the sheriff said, glancing at Tommy. "But the law don't look kindly on appearances." His tone softened slightly. "If you care for your boy, Mrs. Callahan, you'll come back to town. Spare him the whispers." Maeve's lips parted as if to argue, then closed again. She looked at her son, then at Elias. The boy was watching him with wide eyes, trusting, uncertain. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. When the men rode off, Maeve turned to Elias, her face pale with resolve. "They'll take him," she said. "If they think I'm unfit, they'll take my boy." Her voice broke on the last word. She took a trembling breath, her hands clenching at her sides. "Mr. Crow, could you pretend to be my son's father?" The question hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Elias's throat went dry. His mind flickered to the past, the accident, the faces he'd left behind, the life he'd buried beneath the pines. To stand beside her would mean stepping back into judgment, into the world he had tried to escape. But when he looked at Tommy, saw the boy's small fingers clutching his mother's skirt, something inside him yielded. He reached out, steady and slow, and laid a hand on Maeve's shoulder. "All right," he said softly. "If that's what it takes." Maeve closed her eyes, the relief so raw it was almost painful to witness. That night, beneath a sky laced with stars, they stood together outside the cabin while the preacher read a few words from his book. The snow around them gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke. There were no rings, no witnesses save for the forest, but when Elias whispered his quiet, "Yes," it felt like a vow carved into the marrow of winter itself. Inside, after the preacher left, Tommy crawled into Elias's lap without hesitation. The boy's head rested against his chest, and the sound of his small, steady breathing filled the silence. Maeve watched from across the room, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. Elias looked at her, and in that glance, something wordless passed between them. A fragile truce, a promise born not of love, but of mercy. Outside the wind began to die, leaving only the hush of falling snow. And somewhere in the distance, the old woods seemed to sigh, as if even the trees understood what it meant for two broken souls to lean together, just long enough to stand upright again. The thaw came late that year, slow and stubborn, as if the land itself refused to let go of sorrow. Snowmelt ran in silver threads down the hillside, whispering through moss and root. The woods no longer stood silent. Crows returned to the trees, their cries sharp and alive. In the clearing, Elias Crow split the last of the frozen logs, his breath still visible in the cold morning air. Inside the cabin, Maeve hummed softly while stirring the pot, her voice low, uncertain, yet strangely peaceful. It had been weeks since the hurried ceremony beneath the stars. The preacher had long gone and the sheriff hadn't returned. But the memory of their visit lingered in Maeve's mind like a bruise. Each morning she woke expecting a knock on the door, a summons back to judgment. It never came. Instead, life fell into a rhythm, quiet, cautious, and almost gentle. Elias spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He showed Tommy how to whittle, how to tell weather from the scent of the wind, how to listen to the groan of trees before they fell. The boy followed him everywhere, his laughter beginning to sound like something that belonged in this place. Sometimes Maeve would catch Elias watching them, his expression soft, a faint ache in his eyes that made her heart twist. One morning, she found him sitting by the hearth, carving a small horse from pine. The figure was rough but earnest, its edges tenderly shaped. "For the boy," he murmured, not looking up. Maeve wanted to thank him, but her voice faltered. Gratitude felt too small for what he had done, for saving her child, her dignity, her name. So she said nothing, only smiled and went on mending the torn hem of his coat. The world outside their cabin seemed to thaw with them. A tentative warmth crept into the days, and the river began to move again, slow and brown beneath the melting ice. Maeve started to hum more often. Elias began to listen for it. Yet under the peace, something restless stirred, a shadow waiting for its hour. When Sheriff Grady returned, the air itself seemed to change. He rode up the trail at noon, his horse's hooves sucking into the wet earth. Elias stepped out to meet him, wiping sawdust from his hands. The sheriff's face held that wary kindness men wore when they came to deliver bad news. "Crow," he began, dismounting slowly. "I figured I ought to come speak to you before the gossip gets worse." Elias said nothing, waiting. "It's about the widow's kin," Grady continued. "Maeve's husband, Callahan. He had a brother, remember? Worked the timberline years back. Word is you were the one who, well," the sheriff's eyes dropped to the ground. "You felled that tree." The world seemed to tilt. Elias's breath caught, the old guilt uncoiling like smoke through his chest. He had known the past would come for him one day, but he hadn't expected it to wear her name. "I didn't know," he said finally, the words dry and small. "I believe you," the sheriff said, tugging at his gloves. "But she deserves to know, and you know how folks talk. They'll make their own story if you don't tell it first." He mounted again, tipping his hat. "I'd rather it come from you." The silence left behind was heavier than any snowfall. Elias stood there long after the sheriff had gone, watching the empty trail. When he finally turned back to the cabin, his hands were trembling. Maeve was washing dishes in the basin when he entered. She looked up, smiling faintly, until she saw his face. "What's wrong?" He set the axe down against the wall, each movement deliberate. "There's something I should have told you sooner." His voice cracked on the last word. "The accident. The one that drove me out here. The man who died. He was your husband's brother." For a moment, she didn't move. The sound of water dripping from her hands was the only thing between them. Then her face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, hollow realization. "You're lying." "I wish I were." Her breath hitched. "You knew this whole time?" "No," he said quickly. "Not until today. The sheriff told me." She turned away, her shoulders rigid. "All this time, you let me believe." Her voice broke. "You stood beside me, said vows, and you knew." "I didn't," he said again, stepping forward. But she flinched back as if his nearness burned. "I can't stay here," she whispered. "Not with you." She gathered her coat, her movements trembling but certain. Tommy looked up from the corner where he'd been drawing in the dirt, his face confused. "Mama? Get your things," she said. "We're leaving." The door slammed behind them, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Elias didn't follow. He sat down by the hearth, staring into the fire until his vision blurred. He had lived with guilt for years, but this was different. It wasn't the weight of the past now. It was the loss of something that might have been redemption. By the time he realized what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, the storm had already begun. A blizzard, sudden and merciless, swept down from the mountains, burying the trails in minutes. He bolted from the cabin, the wind slashing at his face, the snow a blinding wall. He followed the faint prints in the drifts until they vanished at the creek. "Maeve!" he shouted, but the wind swallowed her name. Then he saw them, two dark shapes huddled beneath the half-fallen trunk of a pine. The sight froze him. Maeve's arms were wrapped around Tommy, shielding him from the cold, her face white with exhaustion. He stumbled toward them, dropped to his knees, and gathered them both in his arms. "It's all right," he said hoarsely, though it wasn't. "You're safe now." He carried them back through the storm, one step at a time, the snow clawing at his legs. The cabin door flew open under his shoulder. Inside, the fire had nearly died, but he fed it desperately, coaxing it back to life. He stripped off their wet clothes, wrapped them in blankets, pressed his rough hands against their frozen skin until color returned. Maeve's eyes fluttered open at last. She looked at him, confusion and sorrow tangled together. "Why?" she whispered. "After what you did, why come for me?" "Because I owed you the truth," he said, voice shaking. "And because I couldn't lose another soul to my silence." She studied him for a long moment, then reached out, hesitant, fragile, and touched his hand. "You can't bury pain, Elias," she said softly. "You melt it, with kindness." The storm outside raged until morning, But inside the cabin, the fire never went out. When dawn came, pale light spilled across the floorboards, glinting off the edges of the tools, the kettle, the small wooden horse on the table. Maeve lay resting with her son beside her, their breathing steady. Elias sat by the window, watching as the world beyond the glass turned from white to gold. He felt emptied and full all at once. A knock came just as the sun lifted clear of the trees. Sheriff Grady stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He took one look inside, at Maeve sleeping peacefully, at the child curled against her, and then at Elias, who met his gaze without flinching. "Guess there's nothing that needs saying," the sheriff murmured. He replaced his hat and stepped back into the morning light. Spring crept over the valley in the weeks that followed. The river swelled with melted snow, the grass pushed through the thawing earth, and the woods breathed again. Elias repaired the fence line while Maeve planted herbs near the cabin. Tommy ran between them, his laughter a small echo of joy against the hills. Some nights, they sat by the fire together, the silence between them no longer sharp but tender. Maeve would sometimes hum, and Elias would close his eyes, letting the sound settle in him like peace. They didn't speak of love, not in words. It lived instead in the small things, the warmth of shared coffee, the mended shirt left folded neatly by the bed, the way Maeve's hand would brush his as she passed the lantern. Years later, the old-timers in town still spoke of them, the widow and the woodsman who made a life out of whispers and snow. Some said they'd been cursed, others said they'd been blessed, but those who'd seen them together in spring knew better. They'd seen how two broken souls could build a home out of forgiveness. And if you'd asked the old voice telling this tale by a dying fire, he would have said this: love in the West was never thunder or lightning. It was just two people who refused to leave when the wind howled hardest. So if you ever find yourself lost in the cold, remember this story. Remember the man who carried his past through a blizzard, and the woman who melted it with mercy. Remember that some winters end not in frost, but in the slow thaw of grace. And if this tale warmed something inside you, traveler, stay a while longer. Subscribe and let the fire burn a little brighter for the next Wild West tale yet to come.